Hi everybody, and welcome to video number 2. We're going to be going over the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Vietnam War protests. These are 3 other topics that you may choose for your Unit 2 discussion board. Okay, the Bay of Pigs invasion, you have to go back to 1959 to the origins of this, when the Cuban Revolution put Fidel Castro in power and Cuba became a communist government, which it still is today. The plans for the Bay of Pigs had actually been formed during President Eisenhower's time in office. Eisenhower administration, along with the CIA, formulated this plan. The CIA secretly trained Cuban exiles in Guatemala, and President Kennedy was informed of this plan when he became president in January 1961. The exiles were set to land at the Bay of Pigs. It was hoped that when the exiles landed and invaded at the Bay of Pigs, Cubans would rise up along with the exiles and oust Fidel out of power. Okay, that did not happen, and we're going to get into that. Okay. April of 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred 3 months after Kennedy took the oath of office as our 35th president of the United States. U.S. government was to aid exiles with 2 airstrikes. After the first airstrike, the involvement of the U.S. government became obvious, and Kennedy pulled that military protection and canceling the second airstrike. Approximately 1,200 exiles were taken prisoner and 100 were killed. President Kennedy ended up negotiating the release of all the exiles that were imprisoned in Cuba. It was a total fiasco for Kennedy. Cuban Missile Crisis. Don't get these 2 things confused. They happened a year and a half apart and were totally different. Cuban Missile Crisis happened a year and a half after the Bay of Pigs. October 1962, U.S. military surveillance planes photographed nuclear missile sites being constructed in Cuba by the Soviet Union. The Kennedy administration had 2 options in dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Number 1, order an invasion of Cuba, which the Kennedy really didn't want to do because look at what happened with the Bay of Pigs. Didn't go well. Anyway. Or 2, place a naval blockade against Cuba, which is exactly what the Kennedy administration decided to do. They mainly did that because it was feared that an invasion would lead to intervention by the Soviet Union and escalate the conflict. Negotiations during the Cuban Missile Crisis lasted a very tense 13 days. In fact, Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, served as his attorney general and was one of those cabinet members at in the trenches during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He famously wrote a book called 13 Days, and it was turned into a movie. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the U.S. has ever been to nuclear war. So that is your background to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, Robert F. Kennedy wrote his book, 13 Days, about his experience. The Soviets, which is interesting, removed their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. But another important, interesting thing to know, this was not known to the American public for many, many, many years. Because kids during the Cold War grew up thinking, with the whole notion of, darn it, we stared down the Soviets and they blinked and they took away their missiles from Cuba. Well, it wasn't exactly that. We agreed to remove our missiles from Greece and Turkey when the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. So anyway, very interesting. Okay, the next topic I want to go over is Vietnam War protests. This is the last topic I'll be going over in this video, and then the next video will be going over the last 3 topics. Background of this basically is John Kerry in his speech that he gave in front of Congress on April 23rd, 1971. John Kerry served as U.S. Senator from Massachusetts from 1985 to 2013. In 2013, he ended up serving as President Obama's second Secretary of State. He was also the Democratic Party's nominee for president in 2004. From 1966 until 1970, basically the time frame we're dealing with, he served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy fighting in Vietnam. Kerry became very disillusioned through his service during the Vietnam War. It led him to join a group called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. This group was formed in 1967, and consisted of those that had served in Vietnam who were now vehemently opposed against the war. He was chosen to give a speech before a congressional committee on April 23rd, 1971, and that is the speech that you will be reading if you choose this topic. All right, those are the first three topics I will be going over: the women's rights movement, the Chicano rights movement, and the Black Power movement in my final video. All right, again, if you have absolutely any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.